I became a duchess on a Tuesday afternoon in April, and I remember thinking, as the vicar's voice droned through the marriage vows, that freedom has a sound when it leaves you. It is not loud or dramatic, but a quiet exhaling, like the last breath of a candle flame surrendering to the dark. My name is Marguerite Sinclair, and I was 24 years old when I sold myself to save my sister. The ceremony took place in the chapel at Thornhill Manor, a vast stone edifice that seemed to swallow the spring light and turn it gray. There were no guests save for the household staff, lined in somber rows like mourners at a funeral. The Duke of Thornhill stood beside me, tall and still, his face carved from the same unyielding granite as the walls around us. He did not look at me during the vows. He kept his gaze fixed on the altar, his jaw set, his hands clasped behind his back. When the vicar prompted him to place the ring on my finger, he did so with the mechanical precision of a man winding a clock. I had met him only twice before that day. The first time was in my uncle's drawing room, where he had come to discuss terms. He was a man of few words, my uncle had warned me, a widower of 7 years who had no patience for sentiment or small talk. The second time was at the signing of the marriage contract, where I learned the full extent of what I was agreeing to. I would bear him heirs, I would manage his household. I would appear at his side when required and disappear when I was not. In return, my sister Cecilia would be spared the necessity of a similar arrangement. She would have a season, a dowry, and the chance to marry for affection rather than desperation. It was a trade, clear and cold, and I had accepted it without hesitation. But standing there in the chapel, feeling the weight of the gold band on my finger, I allowed myself one moment of grief for the girl I had been. The girl who had dreamed of love letters and stolen glances, of a man who would see her not as a solution to a problem, but as something worth cherishing. That girl was gone now, buried beneath the title of Duchess and the iron certainty that I would never be loved. The Duke's voice broke through my thoughts, low and steady, as he repeated the final vow. I forced myself to echo the words, though my throat felt tight and my voice came out smaller than I intended. The vicar pronounced us husband and wife, and the Duke turned to me at last. His eyes were dark, almost black in the dim light of the chapel, and for a brief instant I thought I saw something flicker there, something that might have been regret or recognition. But then it was gone, and he bent stiffly to press a kiss to my cheek, cold and formal, before stepping back. We did not speak as we walked down the aisle. The household staff bowed as we passed, their faces carefully blank. Outside, the carriages were waiting, and the Duke handed me into the first one without ceremony. He climbed in after me and took the seat across, settling into the corner with his arms crossed. The door shut with a heavy thud, and we began the short journey back to the main house in silence. I watched him from beneath my lashes, trying to understand the man I had bound myself to. He was older than I had expected, though not unkindly aged. There were lines at the corners of his eyes and a severity to his mouth that suggested he had long ago forgotten how to smile. His hair was dark, touched with gray at the temples, and his hands, resting on his knees, were broad and strong, the hands of a man who had worked, though I could not imagine at what. Everything about him spoke of control, of a life lived within rigid boundaries, and I wondered what grief or failure had made him this way. When we arrived at Thornhill Manor, he stepped down first and offered me his hand. I took it, feeling the strength in his grip, and allowed him to guide me up the stone steps. The butler was waiting at the entrance, a thin man with a face like a mournful hound, and he bowed deeply as we passed. The Duke released my hand and turned to me, his expression as distant as ever. "You will find your rooms prepared on the second floor," he said. "Mrs. Pembroke will show you the way. Dinner is at 7. I expect you to join me." It was not a request. I nodded, and he inclined his head before walking away, his footsteps echoing down the long corridor until they faded into silence. I stood there for a moment, feeling the vastness of the house close around me, and then Mrs. Pembroke appeared, a stern woman in black bombazine, and gestured for me to follow. The rooms she led me to were beautiful in a cold, impersonal way. The walls were papered in pale blue silk, the furniture dark and polished, the bed draped in heavy velvet. There was a sitting room adjoining, with a writing desk and a window that overlooked the gardens, and beyond that, a dressing room where my few belongings had already been unpacked. Mrs. Pembroke showed me where everything was with brisk efficiency, then informed me that a maid would come to help me dress for dinner. I thanked her, and she left me alone. I stood at the window for a long time, looking out at the gardens. They were formal and precise, laid out in symmetrical beds of roses and hedges, and there was something oppressive about their perfection, as if even the plants had been trained to obey. The sky beyond was heavy with clouds, and the air smelled of rain. I thought of Cecilia, safe in our uncle's house, laughing with friends or reading in the library, and I felt a fierce, painful love for her that made my chest ache. This was the price of her happiness. This vast, silent house, this cold man, this life of duty and silence. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass and closed my eyes, letting myself grieve for just a little longer before I would have to put on the mask of the perfect Duchess. When the maid arrived to help me dress for dinner, she was young and nervous, curtsying repeatedly and stammering as she spoke. Her name was Annie, and she had been with the household for 3 years, she told me, as she fastened the buttons at the back of my gown. She spoke in a rush, as if afraid of silence, and I was grateful for it. She told me that the Duke kept to himself, that he spent most of his time in his study or riding through the estate, that he rarely entertained guests. She told me that the previous Duchess had died in childbirth 7 years ago, along with the babe, and that the Duke had closed off the entire east wing of the house afterward and never entered it again. I listened, saying little, filing away every detail. By the time Annie finished pinning up my hair, I felt as though I had learned more about my husband in 10 minutes than I had in our 2 brief meetings. Dinner was served in a dining room that could have seated 30, but held only 2. The Duke sat at the head of the long table, and I was placed at his right, close enough to speak, but far enough that it felt like a chasm between us. The candles flickered, casting long shadows on the walls, and the silence was broken only by the soft clink of silver against china. He did not speak throughout the first course. I ate slowly, searching for something to say, but everything that came to mind felt trivial or intrusive. Finally, as the servants cleared the plates and brought the next course, I gathered my courage. "The house is very beautiful," I said quietly. He glanced at me, his expression unreadable. "It has been in my family for 6 generations." I nodded, unsure how to continue. "Do you have family nearby?" "No." He took a sip of wine, his gaze returning to his plate. "They are dead or estranged. It makes little difference." The coldness of his words struck me, but I forced myself not to flinch. "I am sorry." He looked at me again, and this time there was something sharper in his eyes, something almost like impatience. "You need not apologize for things that are not your doing, Duchess. We are both here because circumstances demanded it. There is no need to pretend otherwise." I set down my fork, my appetite gone. "I was not pretending," I said, keeping my voice steady. I was attempting courtesy. For a moment, I thought he might respond, but he simply inclined his head and returned to his meal. The rest of dinner passed in silence, and when it was over, he stood without ceremony and informed me that he would be in his study if I required anything. Then he left, and I was alone. I returned to my rooms and sat by the window, watching the rain begin to fall. The gardens below were blurred and gray, and the house felt enormous and hollow around me. I thought of Cecilia again, and I told myself that this was enough, that her freedom was worth my captivity. But as the hours stretched on and the house settled into its cold, watchful quiet, I could not shake the feeling that I had walked into something far more complicated than a loveless marriage. There was a heaviness to Thornhill Manor, a sense of secrets buried deep, and I knew, with a certainty that made my skin prickle, that I was not alone in this house. Not truly. Something was here, something unfinished, and whether I wanted to or not, I would have to uncover it. I did not see the Duke for 3 days after our wedding. Mrs. Pembroke informed me, with her usual brisk efficiency, that His Grace had business matters to attend to in London and would return by the end of the week. She did not say whether he had left the morning after our wedding or if he had simply been avoiding me within the vast corridors of Thornhill Manor. I did not ask. Instead, I spent those days learning the shape of my new prison. The house was immense, far larger than I had realized during my brief tour. There were rooms I had not yet entered, wings I had not yet explored, and corridors that seemed to stretch endlessly into shadow. The servants moved through the halls like ghosts, silent and efficient, appearing when needed and vanishing the moment their tasks were complete. I began to understand that Thornhill Manor was a house built on silence, on secrets carefully guarded and words left unspoken. On the third morning, I woke early and decided to explore the upper floors. Annie had mentioned that the East Wing had been closed since the first Duchess died, and though she had warned me that the Duke did not like anyone going there, curiosity had taken root in my mind. I told myself I was simply trying to understand the house, to learn its history so I might better fulfill my role as its mistress. But the truth was simpler and more dangerous. I wanted to know what my husband was hiding. I dressed quietly and slipped from my rooms before the household had fully stirred. The corridors were dim, lit only by the pale gray light filtering through the tall windows, and my footsteps echoed softly on the polished floors. I passed the main staircase and turned down a narrower hallway, following the path Annie had described. At the end of the corridor, I found a heavy oak door, its surface dark with age. A key hung from a hook beside it, as if someone had intended to lock the door but had forgotten, or perhaps had simply given up. I took the key and turned it in the lock. The mechanism groaned, reluctant, but it gave way, and the door swung open with a slow, mournful creak. The air beyond was stale and cold, tinged with the faint scent of dust and something else, something I could not quite name. Lavender, perhaps, or old perfume. I stepped inside and found myself in a sitting room, frozen in time. The furniture was covered in white sheets, the curtains drawn against the light, and every surface bore a thin layer of dust. It was as if the room had been abandoned mid-breath, as if its occupants had simply vanished and no one had dared to disturb what they had left behind. I walked slowly through the space, my fingers trailing over the shrouded shapes. There was a writing desk near the window, a settee by the fireplace, and beyond that, a door leading to another room. I pushed it open and found myself in a bedchamber. The bed was grand, draped in heavy brocade that had faded to a dull gold. A wardrobe stood against one wall, and beside it, a dressing table with a silver-backed mirror. I moved closer to the dressing table and saw a hairbrush still lying on its surface, a few strands of pale hair caught in its bristles. Beside it was a small glass bottle, the perfume inside long evaporated. I picked it up and turned it in my hands, feeling the weight of it, the intimacy of something so personal left behind. This had been her room, the first Duchess, the woman my husband had loved and lost. A pang of something I could not name moved through me. Jealousy, perhaps, or sorrow, or simply the sharp awareness that I was a replacement, a second choice born of necessity rather than desire. I set the bottle down carefully and turned away, my throat tight. As I moved toward the door, my gaze caught on something else. A painting hung above the mantelpiece, its surface dimmed by dust but still discernible. It depicted a young woman with fair hair and a gentle smile, seated in a garden with a book in her lap. She was beautiful in a delicate, ephemeral way, and I understood at once why the Duke had never recovered from her loss. She looked like someone who had been loved deeply, and whose absence would leave a wound that could never fully heal. I stood there for a long moment, staring at her face, and then I turned and left the room. I could not bear to linger there, surrounded by the remnants of a love I would never inspire. But I did not return to my own rooms. Instead, I continued down the corridor, driven by a restlessness I could not explain. At the far end of the East Wing, I found another door, this one unlocked, and beyond it, a narrow staircase leading upward. I hesitated, then climbed the steps, my hand trailing along the rough stone wall. The staircase opened into an attic space, low-ceilinged and cluttered with trunks, old furniture, and stacks of boxes. Light streamed through a small round window, illuminating the dust motes that hung in the air. I moved carefully through the space, peering into trunks and lifting the lids of boxes. Most contained old linens, moth-eaten clothing, and forgotten household items. But in the far corner, half hidden beneath a pile of canvas drop cloths, I found a wooden chest bound with iron. I knelt beside it and brushed away the dust. The chest was locked, but the lock was old and rusted, and when I twisted it, it gave way with surprising ease. I lifted the lid and found myself looking at a collection of books and papers, all carefully bundled and tied with string. I pulled out the topmost bundle and untied it, my fingers trembling slightly. The first item was a leather-bound journal, its cover worn and soft with age. I opened it and saw a name inscribed on the first page in a flowing, elegant script. Lord Edmund Thornhill, the late Patriarch, the Duke's grandfather. I turned the pages slowly, my eyes scanning the entries. They were written in a clear, steady hand, and they detailed the daily workings of the estate, records of expenses, notes on tenants and crops. But as I read further, the tone shifted. The entries became more personal, more confessional. And then, halfway through the journal, I found an entry that made my breath catch. The boy arrived today. I have made the arrangements as discussed. He will be raised in the village under the name I have chosen, and no one will know the truth. It is better this way. The family cannot bear another scandal, and the child is blameless in all of this. But I cannot help but feel that we are making a grave mistake. He is my blood, and he deserves more than this shadow life I have consigned him to. I stared at the words, my heart pounding. A boy, a child raised in secret, a member of the family hidden away and denied his birthright. I turned the pages quickly, searching for more information, and found scattered references throughout the rest of the journal. The boy's name was never mentioned, nor was the identity of his mother, but it was clear that Lord Edmund had provided for him, that he had visited him occasionally, and that he had carried the weight of this secret until his death. The final entry was dated 2 years before the old patriarch had died, and it was brief and cryptic. He has grown into a fine young man, but he does not know the truth, and I fear he never will. I have left instructions with my solicitor, but I do not trust that they will be followed. The family will protect itself, as it always has. God forgive me. I closed the journal and sat back on my heels, my mind racing. A hidden heir, a son who had been erased from the family records, whose existence had been buried beneath layers of silence and shame. And if he was still alive, if he had survived to adulthood, then he would have a rightful claim to everything. The title, the estate, the fortune, everything my husband now possessed. I looked down at the journal in my hands, feeling the weight of what I had discovered. This was dangerous knowledge, the kind that could destroy lives and topple dynasties. And yet I could not put it down. I could not unsee what I had read. Somewhere in this house, or perhaps somewhere beyond it, there was a man who did not know that he was the true heir to Thornhill, a man whose very existence was a threat to the Duke's authority and my own fragile position as his wife. And I had to decide what to do with this secret. I carried the journal back to my rooms, hidden beneath my shawl, my heart beating so loudly I was certain the servants would hear it. Once safely behind my door, I tucked it into the bottom drawer of my writing desk, beneath a stack of stationery I had not yet used. My hands were shaking as I locked the drawer and slipped the key into my pocket. For the rest of that day, I could think of nothing else. The words from the journal played over and over in my mind. A hidden heir, a boy raised in secret, a truth that had been buried for decades, and the questions that followed were endless and troubling. Did the Duke know? Had his grandfather told him before he died? Or was this secret as much a surprise to him as it was to me? And if the Duke did not know, should I tell him? The thought made my stomach twist. We barely knew each other. He had made it clear that our marriage was a transaction, nothing more. To approach him with something so explosive, so dangerous, felt like stepping into a trap I could not see. And yet, keeping the secret felt equally treacherous. What if someone else knew? What if the hidden heir himself discovered the truth and came to claim what was rightfully his? I spent the evening pacing my sitting room, unable to eat, unable to rest. When Annie came to help me prepare for bed, I dismissed her early, claiming a headache. She left reluctantly, casting worried glances back at me, but I needed to be alone. I needed to think. The Duke returned the following afternoon. I was in the library when I heard the carriage arrive, the crunch of gravel beneath the wheels, the low murmur of voices in the entrance hall. I stood at the window and watched as he stepped down from the carriage, his dark coat flecked with rain, his expression as unreadable as ever. He spoke briefly to the butler, then disappeared into the house. I waited, expecting him to send for me, but no summons came. The afternoon stretched into evening, and still there was no word. I took dinner alone in my rooms, the silence pressing down on me like a weight. It was only when I was preparing for bed that Annie appeared at my door, breathless and nervous. "His Grace requests your presence in his study, Your Grace," she said, curtsying. "He asks that you come at once." I felt a jolt of apprehension but nodded and reached for my dressing gown. Annie helped me fasten it and then followed me to the door, but I waved her away. I would go alone. The study was on the ground floor, at the far end of the west wing. I had never been inside it before. As I approached, I could see the flicker of lamplight beneath the door, and I heard the faint sound of something being moved, a drawer closing perhaps, or a book being set on a shelf. I knocked softly. "Enter." I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was smaller than I had expected, lined with bookshelves and dominated by a large mahogany desk. The Duke stood behind it, his back to me, staring out the window at the dark gardens beyond. He did not turn when I entered. "You wished to see me?" I said quietly. He was silent for a moment, then turned to face me. In the lamplight, he looked older, more worn, and there was a tightness around his eyes that suggested exhaustion or perhaps something deeper. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Sit." I did as he asked, folding my hands in my lap. He remained standing, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on me with an intensity that made me want to look away. But I forced myself to meet his eyes. "I have been informed," he said at last, "that you have been exploring the East Wing." My breath caught. I had not expected this. I had thought no one had seen me, that my trespass had gone unnoticed. But of course the servants would have told him. They were loyal to him, not to me. "I did not mean to intrude," I said carefully. "I was simply trying to learn the house. The East Wing is closed for a reason, Duchess." He spoke the title as if it were a reminder, a boundary. "Those rooms are not to be disturbed." "I understand." I kept my voice steady, though my pulse was racing. "I apologize if I overstepped." He studied me for a long moment, and I could not tell what he was thinking. Then he moved around the desk and sat down, leaning back in his chair. His gaze did not leave my face. "What did you find there?" The question was casual, almost offhand, but I heard the sharpness beneath it. He was testing me. I hesitated, weighing my options. I could lie, tell him I had found nothing of interest. Or I could tell him the truth, or at least part of it. "I found the rooms of the former Duchess," I said at last. "They are very beautiful. It must have been difficult to close them." Something flickered in his expression, a brief tightening of his jaw, but he said nothing. I pressed on, choosing my words with care. I also went into the attic. There were old trunks and papers, nothing of consequence. It was not entirely a lie. The journal was of consequence, but I had not yet decided what to do with it. And I needed time to think, to understand what I had uncovered before I shared it with anyone, even him. The Duke watched me in silence, his dark eyes unreadable. Then he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "You are not what I expected," he said quietly. I blinked, startled by the shift in his tone. "What do you mean?" I expected someone meek, someone who would accept their place and ask no questions. "But you are curious, are you not? You explore, you observe, you think." I did not know if he meant it as a compliment or a criticism. I tried to answer honestly. "I do not believe ignorance serves anyone well, Your Grace. If I am to be the mistress of this house, I must understand it." He regarded me for a long moment, and then, To my surprise, the faintest hint of something that might have been approval crossed his face. "Perhaps you are right." The silence that followed was not quite comfortable, but it was less hostile than before. I gathered my courage and spoke again. "May I ask you something?" He inclined his head. "Why did you marry me?" The question hung in the air between us. I had not planned to ask it, but now that it was out, I could not take it back. He leaned back in his chair again, his expression unreadable. "For the same reason you married me," he said at last. "Necessity." I nodded slowly. "But you could have married anyone, a woman of fortune, or title, or beauty. Why someone like me?" He was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and edged with something that sounded almost like weariness. "Because I did not want someone who would ask things of me that I could not give. I wanted someone practical, someone who understood the terms." "And do you believe I understand them?" I asked. He looked at me, and for the first time since I had entered the room, I saw something vulnerable in his gaze, something unguarded. "I do not know," he said softly. "Do you?" I did not answer. I could not. Because the truth was that I did not know either. I had thought I understood what this marriage would be, but now, sitting across from him in the quiet lamplight, I felt the ground shifting beneath me. He was not the cold, indifferent man I had imagined. He was grieving, guarded, and desperately alone. And I realized with a sharp pang that I wanted to understand him, that I wanted to reach past the walls he had built and find the person hidden within. But I said none of this. Instead, I stood and curtsied. "If that is all, Your Grace, I will return to my rooms." He nodded and I turned to leave. But as I reached the door, his voice stopped me. "Marguerite." I turned back, startled. It was the first time he had used my name. "Be careful where you wander," he said quietly. "This house has secrets. Some of them are better left undisturbed." I met his eyes and saw the warning there, clear and unmistakable. I nodded and left the room, my heart pounding. As I walked back through the darkened corridors, I could not shake the feeling that he knew more than he was saying, that he was watching me, waiting to see what I would do next. And I realized that the game we were playing had only just begun. The Duke's warning should have stopped me, but it did not. If anything, it made my curiosity sharper, more urgent. He knew there were secrets in this house, and whether he was protecting them or trapped by them, I could not yet tell. But I could not ignore what I had found. The hidden heir was not a ghost or a rumor. He was real, and somewhere he was alive. I began my search carefully, quietly. I questioned the servants in roundabout ways, asking about the estate, the village, the families who had lived on Thornhill lands for generations. I learned that there were tenant farmers, shopkeepers, a blacksmith, a schoolmaster. I learned that the Duke visited the village rarely, preferring to conduct business through his steward. And I learned, through Annie's innocent chatter, that there was a man in the village whom the old Patriarch had favored, a man who had been given a small house and a modest income for reasons no one quite understood. His name was Thomas Greaves, and he was a carpenter by trade. I waited until the Duke left again on business, this time to attend to matters at another of his properties. Then, on a gray morning when the mist hung low over the fields, I ordered the carriage and told the driver to take me to the village. Mrs. Pembroke disapproved. I could see it in the tightness of her mouth, but she could not refuse me. I was the Duchess now, and I had the right to go where I pleased. The village of Thornhill was small and tidy, a cluster of cottages and shops arranged around a central green. The carriage drew curious stares as it rolled through, and I felt the weight of those eyes on me, assessing, judging. I was the new Duchess, the stranger who had come to take the place of the beloved woman who had died. I would have to earn their trust, if I ever could. I asked the driver to stop near the church and told him to wait. Then I walked alone through the village, my cloak pulled tight against the damp air, until I found the house Annie had described. It was modest but well kept, with a neat garden and a workshop beside it. Through the open door of the workshop, I could see a man bent over a workbench, planing a length of wood with steady, practiced strokes. I hesitated at the gate, my heart pounding. What would I say to him? How could I ask the questions I needed to ask without revealing what I knew? But I had come too far to turn back now. I pushed open the gate and stepped into the yard. The man looked up at the sound, and I saw his face clearly for the first time. He was perhaps 30 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair and a strong, angular face. And his eyes, when they met mine, were the same deep, almost black shade as the Duke's. I felt the shock of recognition like a blow to my chest. There was no mistaking it. This man was of Thornhill blood. He set down his plane and straightened, wiping his hands on his apron. His expression was wary, but not unfriendly. "Can I help you, madam?" I forced myself to speak calmly. "Are you Thomas Greaves?" "I am." He tilted his head slightly, studying me. "And you are the new Duchess, if I am not mistaken." "I am." I stepped closer, trying to read his expression. "I came to see the village, to meet the people who live on the estate. I hope I am not intruding." "Not at all." He gestured to the workshop. "Though I am not sure what interest a duchess would have in a carpenter's trade." I smiled faintly. "I find honest work more interesting than idle conversation, Mr. Greaves." He nodded, and I saw a flicker of approval in his eyes. "That is a rare quality in your station, Your Grace." We stood in silence for a moment, and I searched for a way to steer the conversation toward the questions I needed answered. "How long have you lived in Thornhill?" "All my life. I was born here, and I expect I will die here." "And your family? Are they also from the village?" His expression shifted, became more guarded. "My mother was. My father I never knew. He died before I was born. I am sorry." I kept my voice gentle, sympathetic. "That must have been difficult for your mother." She managed. He turned back to his workbench, his movements deliberate. The old Duke was kind to her. He made sure we had what we needed. There it was, the connection I had been searching for. I took a careful breath. "The old Duke was known for his generosity," I said. "He was." Thomas picked up a chisel and examined it, not looking at me, though I often wondered why he took such an interest in us. We were nothing to him. Perhaps he simply believed in helping those in need. Perhaps. He set the chisel down and turned to face me again, and there was something sharp in his gaze now. Something that made me think he was not as unaware as he pretended. Or perhaps he had his reasons. I met his eyes and saw the question there, unspoken but clear. He suspected. He did not know the truth, but he had wondered, had questioned, had felt the weight of the old patriarch's attention and could not explain it. And in that moment, I made a decision. I could not tell him everything, not yet, but I could offer him a thread to pull. "Mr. Greaves," I said quietly, "if you ever wish to speak about the past, about the old Duke or your family, I would be willing to listen. Sometimes the truth is buried deeper than we realize, and it takes someone willing to dig to bring it to light." He stared at me, and I saw the conflict in his expression, the fear and the longing. Then he stepped back and shook his head. "I appreciate the offer, Your Grace, but I am content with my life as it is. The past is best left alone." I nodded, though I knew he did not mean it. I could see the hunger for answers in his eyes, the same hunger that drove me. But I could not force him, not yet. I bid him good day and left the workshop, my mind racing. Thomas Greaves was the hidden heir. I was certain of it, and whether he knew it or not, his very existence was a threat to everything the Duke had built. When I returned to Thornhill Manor, I found the Duke waiting for me in the entrance hall. He must have returned early, and the look on his face told me he knew where I had been. "We need to speak," he said, his voice low and taut with anger. "Now." He led me to his study and closed the door behind us. Then he turned to me, and I saw the fury in his eyes, barely restrained. "What were you doing in the village?" I met his gaze, refusing to flinch. "I was visiting the tenants. I am the Duchess. It is my duty to know the people who live on our land." "Do not lie to me, Marguerite." He stepped closer, his voice hard. "You went to see Thomas Greaves." "I did." I kept my voice steady. "He is a tenant, is he not? He is more than that, and you know it." The Duke's jaw tightened. "You found the journal." It was not a question. I felt a chill run through me, but I did not deny it. I did. For a moment I thought he might shout, might rage at me for my intrusion. But instead, he turned away and pressed his hands against the desk, his shoulders tense. "You should not have done that," he said quietly. "You should have left it alone." How could I? I stepped forward, my own anger rising. "You expect me to live in this house, to play the part of your duchess, and pretend I do not see the shadows in every corner? There is a man in that village who has a rightful claim to everything you possess. Did you know? Did your grandfather tell you before he died?" He spun to face me, and the pain in his eyes was so raw it took my breath away. Of course I knew. I have always known. And I have spent the last 10 years trying to protect him from a truth that would destroy his life. I stared at him, stunned. Protect him? The Duke's voice was rough, strained. "Thomas Greaves is my half-brother, my father's son, born before his marriage to my mother. My grandfather hid him to protect the family name, but he made sure the boy was cared for. When I inherited the title, I continued that care. I have given him a home, an income, a trade. I have watched over him from a distance, and he has lived a good life, a peaceful life. If he learns the truth, it will take all of that away. He will be forced into a world he does not understand, a world that will tear him apart." I felt the weight of his words settle over me. "And what about you?" I asked softly. "What does it do to you, carrying this secret alone?" He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw the man beneath the title, the man who had been grieving not just for his first wife, but for the burden of secrets he could never share. "It has made me a prisoner," he said quietly, "just as much as it has made you one." The silence that fell between us was heavy with all the words we had not yet spoken. I took a step closer, and he did not move away. I reached out and placed my hand on his arm, feeling the tension in his muscles, the weight he carried. "You do not have to carry it alone anymore," I said softly. "I am your wife. Let me help you." He looked down at my hand, then up at my face, and I saw something shift in his expression, something that might have been hope or gratitude or the beginning of trust. He covered my hand with his own, and his voice, when he spoke, was rough with emotion. "I do not know if I can. Then let us learn together." We stood there in the quiet study, the lamplight flickering between us, and I felt the first fragile thread of connection form. He was no longer just the cold duke who had married me out of necessity. He was a man haunted by duty and loss, trying to protect someone he loved at the cost of his own happiness. And I was no longer just the unwanted duchess. I was someone who saw him, truly saw him, and was willing to stand beside him. But even as that connection formed, I knew the danger had not passed. Because someone else knew about Thomas Greaves, someone who had been watching, waiting. And soon, very soon, that person would make their move. The threat came 3 days later, and it came from a direction I had not anticipated. I was in the morning room when Mrs. Pembroke brought me the letter. It had arrived by special courier, she said, her face pale and tight. The messenger had refused to wait for a reply. I took the letter with trembling fingers, recognizing immediately that it was not addressed to me, but to the Duke. The seal had already been broken. Mrs. Pembroke saw my confusion and spoke quietly. "His Grace asked that all correspondence be brought to you in his absence, Your Grace. He left for London early this morning. He said it was urgent." I nodded, though my stomach had begun to twist with unease. I waited until she left, then unfolded the letter and read. The words were brief and brutal. "I know about Thomas Greaves. I know what he is and what he stands to inherit. If you wish this information to remain private, you will deliver £10,000 to the address below within 1 week. If you refuse, I will go to the newspapers, and I will go to Thomas himself. The scandal will destroy everything." There was no signature, only an address in London. Blackmail. Someone had discovered the secret and was using it to extort money from the Duke. But who? And how had they learned the truth? I read the letter again, searching for clues, but there was nothing. The handwriting was careful and anonymous, the paper plain. Whoever had written it had been deliberate in their obscurity. I sat frozen for a long moment, my mind racing. The Duke had gone to London. Had he received another letter? Was he already trying to deal with this threat on his own? I thought of what he had told me, of the burden he had carried alone for so many years, and I felt a fierce surge of protectiveness. He did not have to face this alone anymore. I would not let him. I stood and rang for the carriage. Mrs. Pembroke appeared again, her expression anxious, but I gave her no explanation. I simply told her I was going to London and that I did not know when I would return. The journey took most of the day, and by the time I arrived at the Duke's London residence, the evening was drawing in. The butler, clearly surprised to see me, informed me that His Grace was not at home. He had left an hour earlier and had not said where he was going. I felt a spike of alarm. Where would he go? To pay the blackmailer? To confront them? I pulled out the letter and looked at the address again. It was in a part of London I did not know well, a district that was neither wealthy nor entirely respectable. If the Duke had gone there alone, he could be walking into danger. I made my decision quickly. I ordered the carriage to take me to the address on the letter. The street was narrow and poorly lit, lined with boarding houses and cheap lodgings. I told the driver to wait and stepped down, pulling my cloak tight around me. The address led me to a shabby building with peeling paint and a crooked sign. I climbed the steps and knocked on the door. It opened almost immediately, and I found myself face to face with a woman I recognized. It was the Dowager Duchess, the Duke's aunt, his father's sister. She was an elderly woman with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, and I had met her only once at a brief and uncomfortable tea shortly after my wedding. She had made it clear then that she disapproved of me, that she believed I was beneath the family's station. Now, standing in the doorway of this dingy lodging house, she looked both defiant and cornered. Her eyes widened when she saw me, and then narrowed. "So," she said coldly, "he sent you instead. How very like him to hide behind a woman." I stepped inside without being invited, forcing her to move back. I closed the door behind me and faced her. "You wrote the letter." It was not a question. She lifted her chin, unrepentant. "I did. And I meant every word. That boy has no right to exist, much less to threaten everything this family has built. If my brother had been stronger, if my nephew had been wiser, none of this would have happened. Thomas Greaves is an innocent man." I kept my voice steady, though anger was building inside me. "He has done nothing wrong. He does not even know who he is. And he should never know." The Dowager's voice was sharp, bitter. "But your husband is weak. He has always been weak. He could have paid off the mother, could have sent the boy far away, but instead, he chose sentiment. He chose to keep the boy close, to watch over him like some kind of guardian angel. It is foolishness, and it will ruin us all. So you decided to blackmail him, to force him to pay you to keep silent." I shook my head, disgusted. "You would destroy your own family for money?" "Not for money. For survival." The Dowager stepped closer, her eyes blazing. "Do you know what scandal does to people like us? It strips away everything. Title, respect, position. We become nothing. I will not allow that boy to take what is rightfully my nephew's. And if I must use any means necessary to protect this family, I will." I stared at her, and I understood then the depth of her fear, her desperation. She was not doing this out of cruelty, but out of a twisted sense of loyalty. She believed she was protecting the family, even as she tore it apart. Before I could respond, the door opened again, and the Duke stepped inside. He stopped when he saw me, his face a mixture of shock and anger and something that might have been relief. Then he turned to his aunt, and his expression hardened. "Enough," he said quietly. "This ends now." The Dowager drew herself up. "You cannot stop me, nephew. If you do not pay, I will go to the papers. I will tell them everything. Go ahead." The Duke's voice was calm, almost gentle, and I saw his aunt falter. "Tell them. Tell the world that my father had a son before he married my mother. Tell them that I have spent the last 10 years caring for my brother, ensuring he has a good life. Tell them that I chose compassion over cruelty." I do not think the scandal you imagine will come to pass." She stared at him, her mouth opening and closing, and I saw the realization dawn in her eyes. She had miscalculated. The Duke was not ashamed of Thomas. He was not afraid of the truth. And without his fear, her blackmail had no power. "You are a fool," she said at last, her voice trembling. "You will regret this. Perhaps." The Duke stepped aside and opened the door. "But I will not regret doing what is right. Leave, Aunt, and do not contact me again." She looked at him, then at me, and I saw the defeat in her eyes. She gathered her cloak and left without another word, her footsteps echoing down the stairs. When she was gone, the Duke closed the door and turned to me. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were dark with emotion. "You should not have come here. I could not stay away." I stepped closer to him. "You should not have come alone." He exhaled slowly, and some of the tension left his shoulders. I thought I could handle it. I thought I could pay her off and be done with it. And now? Now I realize that secrets only have power when we are afraid of them. He looked at me, and I saw something shift in his gaze, something open and vulnerable. "You were right, Marguerite. I do not have to carry this alone anymore." I reached for his hand, and he took it, his fingers warm and strong around mine. "What will you do about Thomas?" "I will tell him the truth. He deserves to know, and then I will give him a choice. He can claim his birthright, or he can keep the life he has built. Either way, I will support him." I smiled, feeling a warmth spread through my chest. "That is the right thing to do." He squeezed my hand gently. "And what about you? Do you regret this marriage? Do you regret being drawn into all of this?" I looked up at him, at the man who had been a stranger just weeks ago, and who now felt like the other half of my soul. "I do not regret it," I said softly. "I thought I was surrendering my freedom when I married you. But I was wrong. I found something far more valuable." "What is that?" "I found someone worth fighting for." His expression softened, and he raised my hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to my knuckles. "Then you have given me something I thought I had lost forever," he said quietly. "Hope." We stood there in that shabby room, holding each other's hands, and I felt the last of the walls between us crumble. This was not the marriage I had imagined, but it was something better. It was real, and it was ours, built on truth and trust and the willingness to face the darkness together. 2 weeks later, the Duke and I traveled to the village together. We sat with Thomas Greaves in his small, tidy workshop, and the Duke told him everything. I watched Thomas's face as he listened, saw the shock and confusion, and finally, a kind of quiet understanding. When the Duke finished, Thomas was silent for a long time. Then he looked at his brother and spoke. "I do not want your title," he said simply. "I do not want your estate. I have a life here, work that I love, and I am content. But I would like to know you. I would like to be your brother, if you will have me." The Duke's voice was rough when he answered. "I would like that very much." And so the secret that had haunted the Duke for so long was finally laid to rest, not in scandal or ruin, but in reconciliation and kinship. Thomas remained in the village, living the life he had chosen, and the Duke visited him often. They became, slowly and carefully, the brothers they had never been allowed to be. As for me, I found my place at Thornhill Manor. I was no longer the unwanted duchess, the stranger in a cold house. I was Marguerite, the woman who had dared to uncover the truth, who had stood beside her husband in his darkest hour. And the Duke, who had been so closed and distant, learned to open his heart again. He learned to trust, to love, and to let go of the grief that had held him captive. On a quiet evening in late summer, as we walked together through the gardens, he took my hand and told me that he loved me. And I, who had once believed I would never be loved, told him the same. We had both surrendered something at the altar that April day. But in the end, we had gained far more than we had lost. We had gained each other, and that, I knew, was worth every sacrifice.